Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Man Without Gravity. So, the thing that I like about this film, and I've seen this twice now, I really kind of enjoy how simple this movie is. How reasonably we have a character that we have to showcase through his entire lifespan. We end up having a character that reasonably needs to live in seclusion because otherwise he will quite possibly float away. We end up having several instances where this character goes on to do some kind of task or something of some kind, and then he accidentally almost needs to like grab onto something or he'll just fly off. We have it to where this character compares himself to a Superman or a Batman or something in comparison, but reasonably, this guy has no power of his ability, of his power, let's just say. And so we have a character that takes this takes this ability to seemingly rise above the ground and basically tries for his whole entire life to weigh him down so that way he has the ability to act like a normal person. At some points and sometimes we have it to where Oscar becomes very much of a hermit person, but then eventually ends up uh, making friends, eventually even making a lover, and eventually even going on to, because of this kind of secluded, kind of shut in like life, we end up having this character finally showcasing his talent, finally saying, well, you know what? I am going to show the world what I can do. And we get to there within this movie as well. Um, it's a real kind of fun movie. It's really a interesting film, and at the end of the day, I think that's probably about it. Anything else would probably be leading up or really teeing up this movie much more so than I have. Going into this film, it's kind of interesting to see the naivete of this character Oscar because he's an innocent. Like we have it to where Oscar doesn't realize that there's people out there uh, that are going to shaft him at some point, and so we end up having Oscar just going in and thinking that he's going to get a book deal. He's thinking that he's going to uh, be able to have like the doors open wide for him. And we also have it to where his agent of sorts is kind of telling him that also, where it's like, yeah, like all opportunities are gonna just be begging at your feet as soon as people get to find out what you are doing, like and your talents and everything like that. People are just gonna be like, oh my god, like we got to get more of this guy. So interestingly enough, it's a story about a guy that otherwise has the inability to keep his feet on the ground. It's very hard for him to be able to keep his feet on the ground, so he lives an entire life with a backpack strapped to him. And I think that really is the most interesting part of this movie. Like the whole phrase, like the sky's the limit. Well, for this guy, it's like, well, I shouldn't test that theory, or I will just die. So with this character, Really interesting journey. I really enjoy this story, but with that said, I think it's about time to go into that coveted double five time territory. Yeah, at the end of the day, that's all I could say about this movie because everything else is just like I'm basically giving the movie away. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So in the very beginning of this film, we end up having a woman named Natalia who is giving birth to a child. I wonder who this child is going to be. So we end up having Natalia giving birth to this child, and once this girl does give birth to this child, we end up having the baby just kind of floating out of the doctor's hands, where she's like grabbing the baby so that way he doesn't float away. It seems that the baby is otherwise tied to the placenta, so reasonably, like, he wasn't going to get very far. But anyways, we end up having Alina, which is actually the grandmother, asking Natalia, like, oh, okay, like, we need to know, like, who the father is. Like, this is weird. Like, this is, like, we need to know, like, I need to know who the father is. And Natalia is like, well, I don't even know. I don't even know who the father is. And it's like, well, like, is it and like, we end up calling him, like, Angel and all kinds of things. And we end up having it to where, like, Oscar, who is the main character in The Gravitied Man, we end up having him consistently being trying to be called Angel, and he hates that. We end up having at some points in time that Oscar is to be dressed as an angel at portions of time, and he hates it. So we end up having to realize that this kid needs to be able to go to school like a common person. And so we have it to where this kid is like floating up in the air, and they have really tried to figure out a way to control this kid just floating off. We end up having at some point uh, Natalia ends up buying Oscar a backpack to where he puts onto his back, to where he has to put weight in it, so that way he can be able to stay upon the ground. At some points, it seems that there were every time that Oscar had pockets for something, they would try to uh, add weight to said pockets. Like, you would think then that, like, Oscar would try to be like a 300-pound guy or something, so that way he could weigh himself down on, so that way he'd be heavy enough to, like, you would think that that would have happened, but no, like, Oscar is a very skinny guy. So I guess because of the environment of which they live, I don't know. But anyways, so we have it to where, funny enough, when the child is to be brought home as a baby, uh, we end up having the grandmother bringing in some of her friends to see the baby. But funny enough, she tells him, it's like, oh, well, don't touch the baby. Like, he has germs. Like, he's very, like, he has problems with germs. So, like, don't touch him. They simply didn't want them to touch him because they didn't want to, like, try and pick him up, because they tried to, like, uh, they tried to, uh, like, belt him to the ground kind of thing as a child. So we go on into this story, and so eventually there's police officers that are sent to Natalia's home to say, like, well, hey, like, this kid has to go to school, like, he's of age to go to school, like, and somebody must have called them in and whatever. And so we end up having Oscar going to like, going forcibly to a school, but then they realize, like, how much of a mistake that was. And so both mother and grandmother pull Oscar out of the school to just be like, well, maybe you'll go next year. To where eventually the grandmother otherwise decides, like, well, no, like, I'm just going to teach him at home. So we end up having eventually that Oscar is to go out on the town one day, and he ends up bumping into a girl named Agatha, and so we have Agatha who ends up telling Oscar, well, hey, like, since you bumped into me, you're going to help me bring my items to my home. And so Oscar's like, well, hey, well, that's great, because if anything, these things are really heavy, so I should be fine to just take these items and not have to hold on to my backpack for so long, and so on and so forth. So we have it to where Oscar goes to Agatha's home, and so he ends up giving her the items, but then he ends up realizing that he's starting to float away. So he ends up trying to like grab onto the fire escape so that way he can try to like keep himself from floating off to the sky. And Agatha is like, "Oh my God, you're like Superman, or you're like whatever." We end up having Oscar eventually watching Batman the Animated Series, and so we have it to where Oscar thinks that he is just like Batman, and it's like, well, not exactly, because like your powers aren't exactly controllable, but also it's like I guess it's a good guy to uh, think that you're the same of, but I don't think that Oscar is much of a dark and brooding Ash like person. Um, like years as a shut-in probably would say that he should be, but I guess it is what it is. So we go along on to having Oscar eventually seemingly being more social. It seems that we have Oscar who ends up moving to a much more secluded small town place to where we have Oscar telling Natalia, it's like, well, why are you even locking the door? Like, nobody's going to come in here. So we have to where Oscar ends up going to the bar with his backpack, of course, and we end up having a bar patron that goes in there and keeps calling this guy Backpack. And every single time Oscar goes in there to try to hit on the bartender, and the guy that ends up calling him Backpack is just like, well, like, hey man, like every time that this guy is going to sit here next to this bartender, like get him a drink on me, kind of thing. So we end up eventually having at some point Oscar and this bar guy. They end up watching a, I think, soccer game together, and eventually the TV goes out, and so Oscar's like friend, I guess you could say, even though it doesn't treat him all that well, mentions like, well, hey, like I guess we're gonna need to get the ladder to go and fix the satellite dish, and Oscar goes, well, I won't need the satellite dish. If anything, I can just fly up there and fix the satellite dish myself. I'm like, well, that's not gonna work that way. Anyways, so we end up having Oscar's mother arrive at this bar to tell him, like, well, no, like, you can't do that. Like, you can't, like, it's not going to work that way. And so we eventually have it to where Oscar just gets so drunk that immediately he just wishes that there was something that he could do with this power. There was some place that he could go to showcase his ability somewhere. And so we eventually have it to where Oscar is watching the telly one day, the TV one day, and he ends up seeing a show called Extraordinary Men. to where everybody has special abilities or some kind of trick or something like that that they try to perform within the show. And so we end up having Oscar just packing up his things and realizing, like, you know what, I think it's time to move home, or I think it's time to get out of here, because I want to be able to go onto the show, and it seems like they are casting right where I am at, so it's undeniable that I need to do this show. So we end up having Oscar going and being, I guess, this person upon the show, and so we end up having Natalia just kind of one day, and we end up having someone calling her phone to let her know, hey, isn't that backpack on on the television? And so Natalia ends up turning on the TV to have it be showcased that Oscar is just floating up into the studio, and so we end up having people saying like, "Oh my God, this is so amazing! This is so great!" And immediately we end up having Oscar finding a guy. I believe his name is David, and so David ends up wanting to get a hold of Oscar to say like, "Dude, you have such a great talent. Like, you need to go and perform this talent anywhere you can to get like tons and tons of money." And we have this David character that is going to be Oscar's agent. And so we end up having David having Oscar sign all kinds of things. And immediately I'm like, oh my God, like David is going to like swindle Oscar for all of his money. And so we end up having it to where Oscar ends up doing all these performances, and he ends up kind of being more and more forced to do stuff that he doesn't exactly want to do. We end up having Oscar asking David at one point, like, it would be grand if because David just gives Oscar a house, just like, hey, here you go, this one's yours. And so we have Oscar who immediately asks like, well, hey, can I bring my mother to this house? And so we end up having Oscar eventually like being on the cover of magazines and all kinds of stuff, and he sends it to his mom, and his mother, like, she looks at it, but she really doesn't care because he left. He calls her about it. He lets her know about it, like, "Hey, I sent you this magazine," and she's like, "Oh, well, that's nice." And then she just like she just tosses off to the side because. So we have Oscar that goes on to seemingly doing all these performances, and eventually he does the one thing that he truly wants, is for someone to write a book about him. The only thing is that this person that is writing a book for Oscar isn't even like wanting to know Oscar's life story. If anything, we have it to where this book writer is just fabricating things and lying about things, and like he's already come up with an idea of how to write this guy's life when he doesn't even know this guy's life. So we end up having Oscar telling him, it's like, well, this book doesn't really seem all that accurate. But then again, I think he's just like, well, money. So we end up having Oscar just kind of about that. And so we end up having Oscar eventually being pushed into these performances and having to do these special tasks and performances. We end up having Oscar having to do his act one more time, but he is ending up doing it as an angel, to where he loathed and hated that. So because we end up having David trying to figure out what would be the name to call their act. And immediately David says Angel, and Oscar's like, no, 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 no. Like, I hate that. And so we have it to where David like mentions like, well, you have to be the man without gravity, and then Oscar's like, yeah, that sounds cool. So we have Oscar who is pushed into this big performance, and so he ends up deciding to not go along with it. He ends up like cussing his way out of it and all kinds of things because he's just like, no, like I'm not going to do this anymore. Like I'm not, uh, like I'm done. I'm through. Like this is it. And so we have it to where Oscar has some contract to where he's supposed to do like all of these appearances and all kinds of things, and Oscar's like, no, like I'm just not going to be your monkey boy anymore. I'm just not going to do it. Like this is wrong, and this is not what I want. And so we end up having David telling Oscar like, well, like you can't just back out of this performance. You can't just like you're contracted. Like you're going to get sued by everybody. And so like what should I tell people when they come to when they come for you kind of thing, when they get their lunch bobs out and everything like that. We have it to where Oscar just says, well, tell everyone that I'm dead. Tell them that's the reason why that uh, like just tell them like I flew away one day or I floated away one day and I died. Say that. And so we end up having David going to the news people and fabricating a story about David Oscar dying off. So like I think that this is interesting that this guy had so much fame and he decided to just be like, well, no, like this is I'm done. Like I have no control over what's going on, so like guess what? I'm not going to play anymore. So we have Oscar who goes into some conclusion, grows a big fat thick beard, and is to now be tying himself instead of just a backpack. He ends up tying himself onto a wheelchair, which I'm like, well, that's actually really smart. But this wheelchair is very difficult to get around anywhere of where Oscar is, it seems. Like, we have it to where if you watch it, like, he's like just trying to get this wheelchair going, but it's just like, it's such a difficult thing to do. So, we have Oscar who is now seemingly a clerk for this hotel, a hotel of women that uh, are women of the night. Basically, meaning they're all women that pay for guys to sleep with them, and so on and so forth. So we end up having Oscar going and having a birthday and people giving him gifts and all these women are being really nice to him and blah 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 blah. So we have Oscar who is just kind of going through his day to day and we end up having eventually that Agata is actually one of these women of the night, one of these ladies of the night. And so we end up having Oscar rebump back into this girl, and so we immediately have them uh, going and like falling for one another, and we have it to where Oscar is like giving her gifts like roses and rings and all kinds of things. And so we eventually have uh, this little cutesy love affair, so on and so forth, to where we consistently have this couple like dancing, but like Oscar ends up like taking off his backpack in his room with Agata, and so we just have it to where Oscar is like consistently like floating onto his like like onto his ceiling, and so Agata is just like holding on to Oscar's legs, and they're just dancing that way, bizarrely. Um, like you would think that she would have just tried to like weigh him down, but I guess it is what it is. So we had eventually where Agata and Oscar ends up sleeping with one another, all kinds of things. So we eventually have it to where Oscar eventually like keeps giving Agata gifts, and eventually Agata realizes it's like, you know what? She starts to realize where exactly this relationship is going, which is nowhere, because we have it to where Oscar is hiding out, and Agata is just a woman of the night. It's like so we end up having Agata coming to Oscar and saying like, how far are we gonna go in our lives with a woman that sleeps around with men for money and a handicapped, crippled person? Like, how are we gonna be able to get anywhere with our lives? And so we end up having Oscar taking this as just like, well, you know what? Like, I think it's, uh, you know what? I think it's time to call this relationship over, kind of thing. And so we have it to where Oscar decides to go on his own, and we eventually have Agata ending up coming back to Oscar saying, well, you know what? Like, how about we kind of like call it a truce kind of thing? And how about I do something to make you happy? And so at the tail end of this movie, we end up having Oscar, who is dressing up as Batman and is tying himself to something to go and uh, clean windows nearby an old folks' home. Just kind of like on this like skyscraper like thing where there's elderly people there. And so we end up having Oscar just kind of floating up in the sky, and everybody's like, oh my God, this guy's crazy. Like, how is he able to do this? And we have it to where Oscar's just wearing a Batman costume. And he's like, hey, look at me. Like, so that is the way of which that we could probably end this movie. We could probably also end this movie with Oscar eventually wanting to decide to otherwise, like, you know what, like it'll probably come to a time to where this guy will get much older to the point of being far too old, and he will probably decide like when it's time to call it a day, and to decide that he wants to fly up onto the sky and go to heaven. And like that'll be like that would be a really interesting way to have ended this movie, and so on and so forth. But it is what it is. Like, there honestly were very few times where we had it to where Oscar like ends up almost flying out of the sky. Like, you would think that there would have been really a lot of times of Oscar being challenged by maybe even simple things like weather or something along those lines. Like, there could have been any number of issues that could have happened with this character during this entire film, which would have made this even much more exciting than what it actually was. Like simple things that could really make us have Oscar feel like he's in danger consistently, or something along those lines. But I guess in all actuality, like they just didn't have that kind of time, or they just didn't want to put that together, or there was any number of things that they could have done with this story to make it even much more exciting through most of this movie. But with that said, that's all that I could say about this film. Overall, just really, I enjoy it I enjoy it because of its simplicity. I enjoy it because it's an almost entire lifespan of a guy's journey, and I kind of like how he was kind of forced to be like shut in. We have it to where this character is consistently like walking on the ceilings, and we have it to where like uh, the mother and the grandmother are just like, oh my god, like we have to like baby proof our home, or otherwise this kid is just gonna be on the ceiling somewhere. We end up having Oscar eventually falling asleep on the ceiling of his room, and I thought that was like the most interesting moment. Going into here, yeah, like I'm kind of curious to see how exactly they did these moments, and like it would just be kind of interesting to see that maybe they had to like astronaut some things and whatever to make it seem, or just camera magic, or just strings, or something along those lines would have been interesting with this movie. But with that said, I am going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.